It is time to reopen these schools. Hello, hello, all those beautiful faces. How we doing? Stephanie checking in with another episode of Class Disruption. And this week we're talking about if and when schools go back, what that should look like. But before we get into it, you know what I need you to do. Smash that like button. If you're new here, I love your beautiful face. Welcome. Hit that subscribe button and that bell so you can get notified every time I drop a video. And let me know in those comments down below, where are you checking in from? Where do you work? What's your role in that school? And or maybe you're a parent or you're a student, let us know that too. Check in, let us know what the vibes are. And of course, I need you to share this video. That is the most important thing that you can do to spread this disruption to a class near you. I've been saying I was going to do this, but I really wanted to take my time, do my due diligence with the research, really make sure that I was getting in there, reading the articles, and then also kind of like looking across the spectrum and seeing how this was being reported. Because of course, like everything in America these days, it is highly political and highly narrative driven. And so in this video, we're going to look at that, but more so I'm going to give my opinion on whether I think schools should open, how they should open. I'm going to show you different articles from around the world about how schools have opened, what that's looked like, how successful they've been. And then I'm going to do another video that specifically goes into the situation in New York and how I think that my more general opinion for when and how schools can open would apply to a place like New York City. And I also really want to do a video about why I think it's so urgent that we get back, right? Like there could be an argument, well, just, keep the kids at home. It's the safest thing to do. So I want to do a video on that. I don't know if I'm going to have time, but we'll see. I'll briefly go into it here as we're getting going though. Also, I just want to remind you, this topic is particularly important. All the things, all the article, all the sources that I use are going to be in that description down below. So definitely check those out for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. You definitely have to do your own due diligence and analyze the information and apply it how you think best. This is just one opinion, one perspective, and I hope you can find value of it. And of course, I want to know what you're thinking, push back on me, tell me where you think I'm right, tell me where you think I'm wrong, and let's have that conversation in the comments. That's what this is all about, trying to find the best solution. And I definitely don't think I always have the best solution, and I always want to have that conversation. So to start off, I'm just going to come out and say it. I think schools should open if there is low community spread, a low infection rate, and if there's proper protocols and mitigation efforts put into place in the school buildings. My opinion is actually very well captured by the title of this Nature article, How Schools Can Reopen Safely During the Pandemic, Mass Class Sizes and Hygiene Are Important, but Low Community Spread is the Key. So again, that's going to be a theme throughout this, is that low community spread piece, because we're actually going to see that different countries take wildly different approaches. Some wear masks, some don't wear masks, some are more strict, some are less strict, and it really seems that that community spread piece is the key. I'm also going to talk about the vaccine, T-cell immunity, and just like how we should approach policy generally and how that applies to the coronavirus and reopening schools in a pandemic. Before we get into all the specifics, I want to look at a summary of all this research and a lot of those different bullet points that I've started to hit on, but they really get at it in a very concise, an academic way. I really like this article because it takes a lot of these individual articles that I've seen and it like coalesces the data and it puts it in a very consumable form. So let's take a look at their executive summary and then we'll get into some of the more specific elements. So here's the article right here, Summary of School Reopening Models and Implementation Approaches During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And like I was saying, they look at a bunch of different studies, like individual studies of places, and they put it all together. And this was their findings. And once I found this, I was like, wow, this almost perfectly summarizes what I think. There's a lack of scientific consensus about the impact of school closures and reopenings on community transmission of SARS-CoV-2. There's considerable concern about the indirect effect of school closures on students and parents. Most models of school reopening involve reductions of class sizes, increasing physical distance between students, and keeping students in defined groups with limited interactions between groups to reduce potential for wide-scale transmission within school. And so this is a lot of the things that I'm talking about when I say those proper mitigation protocols for going back in school, right? We should have smaller classes. We should make sure that there's ability to physical distance, create these bubbles of kids so you don't have, kids walking all over the building as you might usually picture, especially at the high school level. And then they go on with more stuff like this, right? You could have different shifts, staggering starts. Like in New York City, we're having, A and B days. A number of countries only had younger students while the older students stayed at home. So then you could spread kids out more. And then the last two are pretty interesting because, as I was saying, there's some things that you see pretty widespread and across the boards, and then there's other things that are less consistent. So you can see they say in a number of countries, face masks are required for students and or staff with variability of the lower age limit for face mask requirements. However, some countries are not using face masks as a part of their reopening model, right? So there's some inconsistency there, even though I think especially here in New York City, we're like mask. And then similarly, I think something that is being called for a lot here in the United States, but isn't necessarily being done a lot, is this systematic school-based testing for the virus or for antibodies, right? They're finding it's really only being done on a small scale in a limited number of settings, and it's not widely implemented. So that's something that's very interesting, and especially when I talk specifically about New York City, I'm going to be talking more about this point. So I really wanted to start off this video by addressing that first bullet point in that executive summary where it talks about the lack of consensus on school closures and community transmission, and also that there's concern about the indirect effects of these school closures. I don't think that there's enough time in this video to go into as detail as I want. I'm going to try to make another video on that. But what I am going to say is that even though the data is inconclusive at this time, it's just too soon, right? Usually that there's a delay in that data at least a year, if not two. But preliminary data is showing that there are real spikes in mental health issues, be it stress, depression, anxiety, and that it actually has increased as the lockdowns have gone on. I am going to link that information down below in my citation so you can at least start going through it and see some of the sources that I'm working off to make that assumptions. There's the Kaiser Family Foundation poll. I have something from the NCIB and from the JAMA network, which has different scholarly articles. But also, let's get this conversation started. Take a look at those and let me know in the comments what you think about mental health and the longevity of the lockdowns and not having in-person schooling. Okay, so now I want to show you one of the issues that I encountered when I was researching for this video. Because like I said, it's so partisan and it's so narrative driven. And if you don't really do your due diligence to click through the sources that they link and to really analyze the language and the framing that they're using, and likewise compare and contrast it to alternative narratives, whether they be something that is truly more objective or something that's the other side of the political spectrum, you're going to start to find this pattern. So I want to take a look at this political article and just show you how they, at best are obfuscating the facts, and at worst, participating in the driving of a false narrative, and just completely irresponsible. But let's take a look at this article. Okay, so here's the political article. Open schools are the exception, not the rule around the world. And I just want to start off by looking at this claim. They are the exception, not the rule, because as we're going to see, what the evidence they provide for that is so misleading. Okay, so we're going to look at that. But let's just get into it because you can see right off the bat, President Donald Trump
often cites examples from Europe as evidence American schools can reopen in person in fall despite COVID-19. But he fails to mention one thing: they are exception, not the rule. And so right away, just starting off with framing this issue with Donald Trump, I mean, I talked in one of my other videos, and I've mentioned this over and over again, but I did a video specifically on how anytime you're using like Donald Trump or Betsy DeVos, it's just like gaslighting. Yes, they should be involved in the conversation and they should be providing support and resources, but the way that our federal system is set up is it's such a hyper localized, or at least state issue, that when you're talking about Donald Trump, it's just like, it doesn't have to do with what we're talking about here. Like, he has no control over what happens in local schools. And then they say right here, only a few countries have open schools nationwide in the manner Trump administration is pushing. So again, like, what manner is the Trump administration pushing, right? He kind of keeps this whole general. He never says like what specifically that manner is. I mean, Trump wants the kids to get back to school, but he did, in Trumpian form, of course, walked it back. Then he was like, oh, it has to be based on local. You know what Trump does? Just Trump, Trump, Trump. Come on. So again, he just keeps this very vague claim in this manner Trump is pushing. They include Norway, France, and New Zealand, as well as Nicaragua, Taiwan, and Vietnam. On the other hand, 143 countries have instituted country-wide closures. And so we're going to click on this. This is what their source is linking to. Okay, so if you look here, it links us to a date that's 5/26, so May 26th. But that article was written on 7/30. That's 2 months, over 2 months previous is the date that they're linking us to. And also what's interesting is that it's not even correct. Like, if you look here, the United States is partially open, which means that there are some kids doing in-person learning. So I guess he's only listing like these fully open, like France was fully opened, Belarus was fully open. So he mentions, I guess he's only counting these places that are fully open, but he said Australia too. So I don't even know. Oh no, it was New Zealand. Let's see what New Zealand's status is. New Zealand is right here. That's Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, New Zealand, fully open. So he's only counting places that are fully open, not partially open. And so this goes back to what I'm talking about with like obfuscating how American politics work. Like, it's not an all or nothing thing. We're federalist. So and these other places are partially open too. So super misleading to only say 7 countries that it's the exception. I mean, places in the United States have made it happen too. And then let's just see what happens as we move along the timeline. You can see, even by the time that he's writing the article, more and more places are partially reopening, fully reopening, right? Look at this. Boom. And then everybody's like on summer break, but more and more are gearing up to go back to school. And then you can see more on break, partially reopening, some places going from light blue to pink, right? And then when we get today, we have more people that are basically fully reopened. So that's what I'm talking about. It's just super misleading. Like, how are you going to write an article at the end of July and link your source from 2 months earlier when it's a moving source? It's not like the source captured that moment in time and, you link to it to show that, like, every day it updates. Like, it's just super misleading, even how they were representing what they were linking as their source. All right, so back to the article. Countries with open schools tend to fall into 2 categories. Some took swift action against the pandemic in January to minimize disruption. Others were less proactive in the fight against COVID-19, the disease caused by the novel coronavirus, but they prioritized education and recovery plan coordinated by top levels of government. The United States did neither. And it's just like, whoa. I remember when Donald Trump put a ban on flights from China,
And everybody was jumping down his throat like, this is xenophobic, da 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 da. So do you really think that he's gonna try to take other drastic measures? Like, you guys are just gonna tell him not to do it. And then second, where it's talking about how education was prioritized and it was coordinated at the top levels of government. Again, schools are hyper local, and at least like state level, like that's where the majority of the funding and the decision making happens. There's a little bit of federal funding that goes into it, but they have very little control. And anytime Trump says that he wants to do something in the schools, everybody turns around and retorts, oh, you don't have power and control. It's just like, it really seems like a no-win situation. And it's like, I hate that you guys are sitting here making me like defend Donald Trump. It's like ridiculous at this point. The whole thing is ridiculous. Unity 2020, Articles of Unity. They put up Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw, and that, I will vote for that ticket in a heartbeat. So I'm not trying to get all into that, but it's just, woo, making me crazy out here. All right, and I mean, that's basically how the article goes. If you're interested in reading the whole article, of course, I have it linked down below, but they just go through and they're basically like, the rest of the world is so good and America sucks. And they totally just like talk about America as this like monolith when it's not. Well, actually, one more note. I do want to show just like another headline, and this was actually written at the beginning of July, on July 6th, and it's put out by the Heritage Foundation, and it says more than 20 schools have reopened. So you can really see how those different narratives, Politico being on the left and the Heritage Foundation being on the right, how they're just like picking up on those different notes and like driving them. But to be honest, like when I read the article, like when I read the Heritage Foundation article, it was pretty well balanced. Like, even though the title is like really trying to hit upon that opposing narrative that the Politico was trying to drive, like I looked through and I linked all, and I clicked all its links, and I thought it was a much more fair framing of the issue. But because I feel like both of those are so highly political, and even though I found the Heritage Foundation to be informative in a way that the political article wasn't, I want to use something that's much less political to really look at the situation around the world and get a look at how different places have opened their schools and how they've fared. So let's take a look at this US News article.
So right off the bat, you can see they have a much more neutral tone. How countries reopen schools amid a pandemic. It's just reporting facts. This is how these countries reopened. And the US, we can take note about how it went. So you can see kids got face masks on, their desks look far apart. As American school officials debate when it will be safe for school children to return to classrooms, looking abroad may offer insights. Nearly every country in the world shuttered their schools early in the COVID pandemic. Many have since sent students back to class with varying degrees of success. And so again, you can see that this article was written on July 22nd. And they're saying many have since sent them back versus that political article that was saying it's the exception. So you can really see that narrative that they're trying to drive. I am a scholar of comparative international education. For this article, I examine what happened in 4 countries where K-12 schools either stayed open throughout the pandemic or have resumed in-person instruction using press reports, national COVID-19 data, and academic studies. Here's what I've found. So, and I really like the 4 that she chose. I think that they're representative of the larger sample of schools and the varied experiences that have been had in reopening schools. So the first one she starts off with is Israel. Too much, too soon. Israel took stringent steps early on in the coronavirus pandemic, including severely restricting everyone's movements and closing all schools. By June, it was being lauded internationally for containing the spread of COVID-19. But shortly after schools reopened in May, on a staggered schedule paired with mask mandates and social distancing rules, COVID-19 cases surged across Israel. School children and teachers were among the sick. Several hundred Israeli schools have closed again. Some blame lax enforcement of health guidelines in schools. The weather didn't help. In May, a record heat wave hit Israel, making masks uncomfortable for students to wear. And then the picture says no social distancing here in Tel Aviv, but I will push back and say like they're outside. So that's definitely something to consider in this particular situation. But schools were only part of a broader reopening in Israel that many experts say came too soon without sufficient testing capacity. The reopening happened too fast, said Mohammed Khatib, an epidemiologist on Israel's National COVID-19 Task Force. It was undertaken so quickly that it triggered a very sharp spike, and return to more conservative measures came too little, much too late. Israel's public health director, Sigal Saditsi, resigned in early July, saying the health ministry had ignored her warnings about reopening schools and businesses so rapidly. So I'm going to take you to a summary of data from all these places after we go through them. But it's also good to know in Israel that they didn't reduce class sizes. They didn't put any of these other like shifts in place. It was just like everybody go back all at once. And then as they know, it got super hot there. And then they kind of got lax with the mask rules. But let's go on to our next example, which is Sweden. So Sweden is very interesting because throughout this whole thing, they take a very hands-off approach, and they are kind of like the one country in the world that went the opposite direction. While everybody else was locking down, they were kind of like, So they say schools closed in Sweden, part of the Scandinavian country's risky gamble on skipping a coronavirus lockdown. Only students 16 and older stayed home and did remote learning. Social distancing and masks were recommended but optional, in line with the Swedish government's emphasis on personal choice, right? So you can see that is in stark contrast to definitely what was going on here in the United States, and from what I can see, almost everywhere else in the world. Sweden was just like, it's your personal choice, do what you want. We'll keep the older kids home so that we can create more space, and that's one risk that we can mitigate without a lot of impact. But let's keep going and see what they say. This strategy earned praise from President Donald Trump, but some resistance from Swedish parents, especially those whose children have health issues. The government threatened to punish parents who didn't send their kids to school. Now, this to me is a bit problematic, right? Because if you're saying like, okay, you can have personal choice, do what you want, but if you don't send your kids to school, that's a little bit of my issue with compulsive education too. It just totally makes the whole thing punitive. So that's a little bit... Sweden's plans seem to have been safe enough. Its health agency reported on July 15 that COVID-19 outbreaks among Sweden's 1 million school children were no worse than in neighboring Finland, who did close schools. And pediatricians have seen few severe COVID-19 cases among school-aged children in Stockholm. Only one young Swedish child is believed to have died of the coronavirus as of this article's publication. So, super interesting. And again, we're going to look at a chart that kind of summarizes all of this information afterwards. But and this is really something more generally, is there isn't a pattern. Some countries locked down hard, some countries did halfway, and it doesn't seem to be that the lockdowns that are a huge influence on this. And Sweden kept their kids 16 and under in schools, and it seems to not have exacerbated it worse than any other place. It says, however, officials in Stockholm have admitted they don't know how the disease may have affected teachers, parents, and other adults in the school. Sweden had over 70,000 COVID-19 cases as of July 21, which puts it in the middle of the pack in Europe, according to a joint study from Sweden's Uppsala University and the University of Virginia. Of those, slightly more than 1,000 involved children and teens. So there is the pushback, okay, but what about the older people in the school buildings, right? What about the students and the parents? What about the teachers and the parents? And I think that this is legitimate concern, but again, based on how Sweden came out in the middle of the pack, I would argue that it seems to not have been any more or less than if they had locked down. Now, there could be some differences. I guess you can say people in Sweden are generally healthier than the people in the United States. So that definitely helps. But I think that we should all be excited about that information. And that's good news. All right, next we have Japan. So far, so good. Japan, which has mostly kept COVID-19 under control, took a conservative approach to reopening schools in June. Different schools have different strategies, but generally Japanese students attend class in person on alternating days, so the classrooms are only half full. Lunches are silent and socially distant, and students undergo daily temperature checks. I just was laughing at the silent part, trying to think about my kids being silent while during lunch. I feel like that's like the most rowdy time of the day. But what I really like here is the different schools have different strategies, and this is what I'm talking about, especially in the terms of the United States and the way that our system is set up, and especially how much it's driven by infection rates, which are local. So we really have to embrace this notion of different places are going to do it differently, and that is a good thing. These precautions are more stringent than those in many other countries. Still, some Japanese children have gotten COVID-19, particularly in major cities. And I'm going to go into this at the end of the video where I talk about the expectation shouldn't be that nobody's going to get that. That's just not a realistic expectation. That is not how we make policy. So I don't necessarily see this as a bad thing. Obviously, like on a human and personal level, like I don't want anybody to get sick. Like I don't want anybody to get this disease. It sounds freaking awful. But like in a realistic policy perspective, that's not how we make policy. It says, a survey from Save the Children found that Japanese school children wanted more clear and detailed information about virus and outbreaks. Parents, students, and teachers continue to express hesitancy about returning to school and displeasure over reopening measures. So this isn't dissimilar to what's going on in the United States, though I would argue probably like in the United States, it's to the more extreme because that's how everything is here right now. But I think that's okay. Like, it's okay to be hesitant. It's okay to like be concerned and to question policy and to hold your teachers accountable. But we have to have that goodwill of like, when it's reasonable, like you got to get back in there. Like every single little thing is not going to be perfect, and there's no perfectly safe situation. All right, and then we got one more that I want to go through, which is Uruguay. A+ for safety. Analysts credit Uruguay's well-organized and efficient public health system and Uruguayans' strong faith in government for its success in stopping the coronavirus. The progressive South American country of 3.4 million has the region's lowest rate of COVID-19 cases and deaths, and it never shut down its economy entirely. Wow, that is interesting. That they have the lowest rates, they never shut down their economy entirely. I think their strong faith in government, I mean, maybe that has something to do with it. And definitely in the United States right now, we do not have very much faith in any of our leaders at all. And we've just seen a total lack, like how to not be a good leader is what we've seen. So I would like to think that Americans are very patriotic, and if we actually have leaders that we feel represent us, that we would have faith in those institutions, but we got to do that work. So definitely interesting to take note, and for how we think about how we're going to handle these issues in the future. Hopefully we can get out of this political mode. Let's see what else it says, though. Uruguay is one of the Western Hemisphere's first countries to send its students back to school using a staged approach. And I'm a super big fan of this staged approach. I'm going to talk more about this when I talk about NYC specifically. In late April, Uruguay reopened its schools in rural areas where the student population is small. Makes so much freaking sense. Like, in early June, it brought vulnerable student groups which were struggling to access online learning and high school seniors back into classrooms. Then all students in non-urban areas went back to classrooms. And this is basically what I'm going to say when I talk about New York City. It's got to be a staged approach. You got to think about where, you got to think about what students, you got to think about what students need. And it just makes too much sense. Like, if our politicians were doing this, maybe I would have faith in them too. You gotta laugh about it or you're just gonna cry, and I can't do that anymore. Finally, on June 29, 256,000 students in the capital of Montevideo returned to school, and an alternating schedule of in-person and virtual instruction reduces the number of students in classroom at one time. I'm a fan of the hybrid too, at least for like the older kids. I think the younger kids, it's a little bit more difficult because then
then they're going to school one day, they're going to another place for childcare, so it almost doubles where they are. But for those kids who don't need childcare and can stay home by themselves and actually achieve what we're trying to achieve, it makes sense.
Uruguay is notable for residents consistent in early adoption of measures like social distancing and masks. Its successful pandemic response comes despite its proximity to hard-hit Brazil, where schools remain closed. And to be honest, like, I'm not totally convinced by all the reporting that the United States wasn't social distancing and wearing masks. Like, everybody who I know, even while the government was telling us not to wear masks, was wearing masks and social distancing, and if they could work from home, they were working from home. So again, I think that's one of those media narratives, like that Politico article, that's just like, it's just not true. And it's trying to push a particular political agenda to make Donald Trump look bad. And again, I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but like, I think it does more disservice to speak untruths of those kinds than it does to just like give credit where credit is due. Or I guess if there's no credit due, just don't lie. Like, integrity, where's it gone? All right, so final grades, let's finish this up. There's no perfect way to reopen schools during a pandemic. Even when a country has COVID-19 under control, there's no guarantee that schools can reopen safely. And this is a lot, again, what I was talking about with, we have to make realistic policy. We can't expect it to be perfect. You have to have good protocols in place for when it does not go the way that you want it to go. But there's a balancing scale here, right? And a lot of people are suffering from these lockdowns in a lot of ways. But the policies and practices of countries that have had some initial success with schools point in the same direction. It helps to slowly stage the reopening. That's exactly what I was saying. Strict mask wearing and social distancing is critical, both in schools and surrounding communities. And both officials and families need reliable and up-to-date data so they can continually assess outbreaks and change, of course, quickly if necessary. And that is even probably a better and more concise, like, executive summary, right? It doesn't talk about the infection rates as much as I would like it to, and which it mentioned in its title. I think it's going to get more into it, but it's got to be slow. It's got to be intentional. Like, we're sending these kids back because they, really need that in person. They don't have childcare at home. They have, special needs. They can't access internet. So we need to be intentional about it. And we also need to inform people so that they can make their own personal decisions about what is safe enough for them. That complicates school reopenings in the U.S. with soaring COVID-19 cases, limited testing capacity, and a decentralized education system. And so now this is where I'm going to disagree with them. While some of those claims might be true about the soaring COVID-19 cases, right? We're in New York City, we already went through our spike, and we might see a second wave, but we don't know. We haven't seen any upticks as we've reopened, things very slow and phased. But other places that weren't hard hit now seem to be going through that wave. What I will say, which is really important, and again, I'm gonna show you a graph of this in a minute, is that as these cases have spiked, we have not seen an increase in deaths or hospitalization. So that's a good sign. And then they talk about, the decentralization of the education system. That's good because, cases in the U.S. nationally are spiking, but there's so many places like New York City where they're not. And so we need to be able to make those decentralized decisions. And again, I'm going to talk about this more in my New York City video. We should even be more decentralized within our system, because this whole centralized system is so slow and lethargic and has nobody's trust. Most countries have national education systems. Interesting. The United States school officials in all 50 states must sort through the same politicized messaging, confusing data as everyone else to make their own decisions about whether and when and how to welcome students back. And I've already addressed all of those concerns. I highly encourage you to go check out that video where I talk about how there's 50 different pandemics throughout the United States. I don't see that as a bad thing. But overall, I really like this article. I think it does a good job of summarizing what we need to do to get kids back, and that it is
possible. Another good article is one I read in the New York Times. We don't have time to go through it here, but if you're looking for more reading, I highly suggest doing it. They also link to a bunch of good research in there, so you can go and dig in and see, okay, like where do they get this information from? So I'm gonna link that one also in the description down below. Another thing I do want to take a look at in this video is a summary chart from that first article I showed you with the executive summary, but this one shows a bunch of countries that have opened and the different things that they've done. So let's take a look at that right here. And you can see they list a number of different countries, and it goes through, okay, when did they close? When did they reopen? If there was younger students or older students, and you can see that it's about half and half. And then they talk about class sizes. There's some places they don't have the data for, but you can see some places have like specific numbers like 10, 12, 15. Some places talk about like percentage, 50%, a third, 2/3. But for the most part, there's a few places like we talked about how Israel opened all the way. It looks like New Zealand opened all the way. We talked about Sweden, but Sweden made it so that older kids were at home. But you can see most of them do reduce those class sizes. There's some of them that do shifts, but for the most part, they're staying away from the alternating shifts or alternating days. And then again, when we talked about those face masks, a couple places it looks like, or one place, Belgium requires teachers. In France, they have the high schools do it, but most places are not having face masks. I guess we have Vietnam and Taiwan wearing face masks, which is a little, I feel like, in Asia they have a little bit more of a face mask wearing culture than we do. But this is definitely one of the things that I was not expecting. I thought like face masks would be like, you definitely need to wear a face mask. Now it's not going to change I'm going to wear my face mask, and I hope other people do too, but it's very interesting to see that that's not one of those determining factors. So then they say reduce class sizes. We kind of already went over this, I feel like, in max class size. Maybe it's just a different way of asking the question. But again, that seems to be, it looks like most places did it, but there's still a handful that didn't. Most have some form of social distancing, increased hand washing. It seems some places have it, some places it wasn't in the report. And then temperature checks, some places have it, some places don't. And then again, we talked about how the testing and the tracing was basically like, that's not a thing. And you can see most places there's question marks, and in Sweden and Vietnam, they're just like straight up no. The testing and tracing is something I'm surprised about. You know, I told you I wasn't buying that media narrative, but it's just been hammered into me so many times that the United States doesn't have testing and tracing, and these other countries, they're so good, they test and they trace and they're on it and da 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 da. And I mean, this study collates a number of different studies from all around the world, and that claim just doesn't seem to hold up to the actual evidence. So that's why we got to do our due diligence. So another thing I wanted to talk about was how even as we're seeing these spikes in different places across the United States and across the world, we're not seeing those same spikes in the hospitalizations and the deaths, which is something I think we can all be happy about. So I want to show a clip from a video that goes through the graphs and really breaks this down.
Now, Sweden has been doing a very lackadaisical job of having people wear masks or do social distancing or anything, but they had this shape of this curve looked like this, came down. And by the way, the 7-day moving average right here at the very end on this side over here on the right side is 285 is what their average is at. So 285 people. New cases showed up most recently on August 10th, and that's out of a country of, 10 million people. But the most interesting thing is that when you look at the deaths have hit 0 and followed this shape right here and came down. So even as cases were sort of trundling along here, see, the cases never hit 0, deaths certainly did. And this suggests the possibility that when this virus is first romping through a population, it's finding the most vulnerable people first. And that would explain some of it. And of course, treatments have gotten a lot better. The bad old days of March and early April, this was just stick people in ventilators and hope for the best. Now we have things like immune suppressive and modifying things, steroids, the Math Plus protocol. We've got heparin and other blood thinners because we know this is a coagulation disease. There's a lot of very elegant things you can do if people are more sick in terms of monoclonal antibodies against the interleukins like IL-6 and IL-1, things like that. So lots of things that can be done.
Another thing I wanted to talk about are T cells. Now, T cells are something that I had never really heard of before this pandemic. We're all, I think, more familiar with the idea of antibodies because we have at least a basic understanding of how vaccines work, and they trigger, a response, and then you have these antibodies if you encounter that at any point in your life. Well, part of that process is actually T cells. They're just not as easy to test for and track as antibodies. So I want to show you another video that explains what T cells are and really breaks down how we could potentially reach herd immunity at a much lower level than we traditionally think you reach herd immunity with vaccines.
What we can do is we can look very simply at the immune system. And up to this point, there's really two types of cells that are involved here that we're going to talk about. And those are the T cells and the B cells. Now, the B cells are important in making, eventually, antibodies. And it's the antibodies that everyone's been looking at because the antibodies tells us that there's been a response against the virus. Well, what they might not have been telling you is that it's the virus that activates the T cells, which then activates the B cells, which then makes plasma cells, which eventually makes antibodies. And these antibodies are proteins that bind viral particles. And so it's sort of the final common pathway, if you will, or a major pathway that shows that immunity has been established. And it's fairly easy to check because you can check for very specific proteins. What's harder to check for are these T cells, but that's really where a lot of this reaction starts off with. It's the T cells. And so what we've noticed, and we've seen this over the last month or two, is that in looking for antibodies, we see whether or not someone has been exposed to or has become immune to the virus by predominantly looking for antibodies. And what we're noticing is that these antibodies can dwindle over time and maybe even disappear. And what we've done is we've made our hope for a response against a vaccine or against herd immunity by looking for these antibodies, when in fact, that may not be all of what we need to have in order to have an immune response. These T cells may be just as important in an immune response against the virus. In fact, where the virus starts is with virus being eaten by macrophages that gets presented to T cells, which then tell the B cells to make the antibodies. And again, I may be oversimplifying this here from an immunological standpoint, but I wanted to sort of get you thinking about these T cells and what they are. One of the reasons why this is important is that T cell responses can last for years, it seems, whereas B cell and antibody responses seem to last on the order of months. Remember, when they checked populations, for instance, in New York, there was a 20% incidence of finding antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. They noticed similar results in Stockholm, which was about 7.3%, and Barcelona, which was about 7.1%. But again, these are generally lower than what is expected in order to have herd immunity. In other words, where there is a high proportion of people in a population that have an immune response or antibodies against a particular virus. So the question is if it's around 20%, what are we seeing in terms of T cells? So we see that we get antibodies in patients who get COVID-19 and are infected with SARS-CoV-2. What do we see with T cells? Well, there was an interesting paper that was published titled Targets of T-Cell Responses to SARS-CoV-2 Coronavirus in Humans with COVID-19 Disease and Unexposed Individuals. And this was published in Cell, and it was just published in June of this year. And what they showed is when they looked at T cells in two different populations, they looked at T cells in population 1, which was patients that were post-COVID, and they looked at patients that were blood donations or blood samples from 2015 to 2018, clearly before COVID came along. And what they found in the first population should not surprise you. They found near 100% reactivity in the T cells. But what they found in 2015 to 2018, again, this is before the pandemic, what they found was that there was a 40 to 60% T cell recognition of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now, that's strikingly similar to what the CDC has been telling us about those patients that are asymptomatic. So realize that many of the proteins on the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 has similar structure to other coronaviruses that have been around for many years that cause the common cold. Is it possible that patients who have had previous exposure to similar viruses to the SARS-CoV-2 have a T-cell response already ready to go? And that is evident in this blood sample that we see here from 2015 to 2018. Well, it would seem as though the answer to that question is yes. I'll, of course, let you look at the article yourself, but they sum it up here at the end of the discussion. They say, in sum, we measured SARS-CoV-2 specific CD4 and CD8 T-cell responses in COVID-19 cases. Using multiple experimental approaches, SARS-CoV-2 specific CD4 positive T-cell and antibody responses were observed in all COVID-19 cases, and CD8 positive T-cell responses were observed in most. Importantly, pre-existing SARS-CoV-2 cross-reactive T-cell responses were observed in healthy donors. These are the ones where they were donating blood prior to the outbreak of COVID-19. They say indicating some potential for pre-existing immunity in the human population. And not only in this article did they find this, but in other groups. For instance, in Germany, they found a 34% reactivity to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. In the Netherlands, 28%. In Singapore, 50% T-cell recognition of SARS-CoV-2 at the outset, even before being exposed to the virus.
So now that we've looked at the big picture of things across the world, seen what other countries done, looked into some studies, science. Everybody likes to talk about science, follow the science, believe the science. And what I think it shows is that there's a really good case for getting back to schools, especially with that low infection rate, right? I've seen this thing out there about if there's one kid who gets sick, if there's one death, it's on your hands. And while on an emotional level, on a real human level, I can identify with that. But in terms of making policy and being an effective leader, we have to somewhat remove ourselves from that emotional level. If we were to accept no death or sickness anywhere ever, you would just be in your home inside a bubble and not do anything. And that's just not a realistic way to live life or make policy. I really like to think about it in the terms of Elizabeth Lotus, right? We had a conversation a couple weeks ago, and she talked about that opportunity cost, that balancing act with the ideals that you uphold. In America, we really value freedom versus what you have to give up of those freedoms for safety, and how much are you willing to give up? Not to mention, on top of that, I really think that we think our policy influences the spread of this perhaps more than it does. I think there are some common sense things that the data really shows does work. Masks and social distancing. But if you look at Sweden versus New York City, right? And if you recall, Sweden was that place super lax, like personal choice, kept kids in school under 16 going while the older kids went remote. And if you look at their death rate compared to New York State, they actually fared better than us. So how do you explain that? I mean, I would argue that you could, the health of the people in the United States is like worse than anywhere else. You know, definitely Sweden, they're all like skinny and like walking everywhere. But so that's definitely a factor, but I don't think it explains like that huge inequity between Sweden and New York State. And New York State had like a crazy lockdown. Like New York City was empty, a ghost town. So I think that we want to be safe, like we want safety, but I don't think we fully comprehend all that we're giving up for this perceived notion of safety when there's not a lot to support that it makes that big of a difference. And then the other thing I've been hearing is like, well, we should wait till there's a vaccine. And my response to that is that could be a long wait, right? I know that there's reports of, oh, vaccine could be as soon as October. But again, we have to think about the political narrative that's going on. There's a lot of reasons, why Trump would want you to make you think that, you know, he's got a vaccine there. And there's a lot of reasons that the Democrats would want you to think that there's a vaccine there. So you'll stay locked down until, you know, that vaccine comes. So it's really hard to believe any of those reports, but just based on how vaccine development works is like, first of all, this timeline is like nothing you've ever seen before. And then second of all, even if we do get a vaccine, it's not going to be widely available to everybody. It'll first be distributed to those more vulnerable populations. So to me, it's just not realistic to make policy, like long-term policy decisions based on this idea that there's like, oh, some vaccine just, you know, a couple months away, 6 months away, another year away, when, you know, the vaccine, they could think that they have a vaccine that comes out and it turns out it's not effective. It turns out it actually has more side effects, and there's so many factors, and we can't be making policy decisions based on something that could be. We have to make the best of what we have right now, and then if we do get that vaccine, we can adjust from there. So just to wrap things up one more time, yes, I do think that kids should be getting back to school, but we need that low infection rate, and we should have those mitigating protocols of masks, social distancing, smaller class sizes. If you could do outdoor learning, amazing, right? If you think that for you and your family, online learning is the best option, like, awesome. Like, stay home, do what is best for your family. Like, if that is a reasonable option, I have nothing against that. My whole thing is that I think that school systems have the obligation to offer an in-person option. So families who need that, whether it's because they have to go to work or whether because their child really needs that in-person option because of their learning style or their learning needs. Again, that is dependent on the infection rate. I don't think, you know, if it's over 5%, you shouldn't be doing the in-person option, but if it's below 5%, it's unacceptable that there are school systems around the country that are like, there's no in-person schooling, but if you want to pay extra to use the same school building that your kid would be in if we weren't saying there was online learning, then you could have them in person. Like that is crazy, and that is unacceptable, and it is just like there's nothing that can better exemplify the ineptitude and the incompetency of government. Like, you can't go to school, but you could pay for your kid to go extra for them to go to school. Like, what? And like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm gonna do a whole nother video about how I think all of this applies specifically to New York City. I teach in the Bronx, so that's what I know best. But I wanna know how you think it applies to your school district. What do you think makes sense for yours? Do you have a low infection rate, or are you one of those cities that is spiking? What protocols do you think should be put in place? What do you think makes the best sense for your population and for your students? Maybe your elementary school teacher, middle school, high school teacher. Let us know in those comments down below. If you haven't already, I need you to hit that like button. If you're new here, I love your beautiful face. Thank you for sticking around. Definitely hit that subscribe button and that bell so you can get more of this beautiful face directly to your inbox every time I drop a video. And I need you to share this video. That is the most important thing that you can do so we can continue to spread this disruption to a class near you. All right, guys, that's all I got for you in this video. It is the end of a long weekend, so I hope you can enjoy what is left of it. I go back to school tomorrow for our first day. It is teachers only, and they actually extended like the teacher prep time for the whole week, and we only see students part-time next week, and we do PD then, and then students officially start on the 21st. So, but like I said, I'm gonna get more into that New York City situation in that next video, but until then, you know what I need you to do. Stay foolish, y'all.
I like